Man, oh man, I do love that song. That is from a band called Smoke Off Vinyl, Chicago band. The song came about 20 years ago, but I thought it was an appropriate theme to the Stories from the 78 podcast. And that's what this is. So thanks for stopping by. I appreciate that you take the time to listen. So I'll be brief, but a little bit about me, and then we'll hear about you. How about that? I'm a 20-year veteran of Chicago radio, television, and now digital and audio and the whole thing. So I was at WGN TV for about 15 years. Prior to that, I was at WGN Radio and then a place called 94.7 The Zone. And there's a little picture up here. I'll get to that later. But that was a rock station in Chicago. Illinois State is where I started my radio career, and then found my way to a rock station in Bloomington Normal, up to Rockford at 97 ZOK, and then landed in Chicago. And I remember my professor at the time, she told me that I was crazy to take an internship in Chicago because I had a job in Bloomington Normal and another one waiting for me in Rockford. But for people who don't grow up in Chicago, who are outside of it, it seems logical to like start small, go to, maybe a place in Nebraska, like Omaha, then go to like maybe another small place like Sioux Falls, make your way to like a place like Sacramento, California, and then hit the big time with the big cities, right? But if you grow up in Chicago, you don't want to do that. You want to work in Chicago. That's where you grew up, and you just think it's going to happen. Well, talk about manifestation, because I decided to move back home with my parents, do an internship at 94.7 The Zone, and that was in the year 2003, I believe. And I ended up working there for about 6 years. Morning show producer, on-air person. I had a show with this guy named Chuck, who hopefully will be a member of or a guest on this podcast at some point. But I did love my time in radio, got to WGN Radio by way of John Records Landecker. I was his producer at The Zone when it flipped format. So let me get into that really quick, because if you've ever been in radio, you maybe have never had the opportunity to be in a situation, and I hope you don't, but never been in a situation where the station flips formats on you right in the middle of your workday. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I was board hopping. So that's when you're running the board for a radio station, right? And in the middle of the day, there's a big meeting called and everybody goes in the meeting, but I was running the board. So I'm in the studio and I'm facing out towards Lake and State, like looking north down down State Street towards the river. And, about a half hour goes by and people start walking by and they're crying. And I'm like, what's going on? Why is everybody crying? People got stuff in their hand. Then somebody comes in. I don't remember who it was anymore, but they say, we just flipped to oldies. So I'm 23 at the time. And I just went from working from an alternative rock station in Chicago to working at an oldie station within a minute. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I was employed. I don't know if I was getting fired. So I just kind of hung out. And then this guy named Ed Glab, who was a engineer for WLS AM and also for The Zone, he comes in and he does some fancy work on his computer, right, on the board, because everything's connected with the computer. And he said, this is the last song you're going to play. And I remember getting a call from Bill Gamble, the program director, and it was From Whom the Bells Toll by Metallica, right? So that's the last song. And then somewhere in there, they said I still had a job because they needed somebody to run the board. And I was young enough and got paid nothing to be able to do this and not, walk out of the building. Meanwhile, I'm freaking out. Everybody is leaving the station. People are carrying the big gold records and the platinum records on the walls of radio stations. People are walking out with that. They're walking out with duffel bags. They're walking out with CDs. They're walking out with everything because you just got fired. So nobody really cared. And From Whom the Bells Toll is 5-minute song, 6-minute song. So I remember people leaving, saying goodbye. And then Ed Glab hit something on the board and all of this music came on that didn't exist about 5 seconds prior. That was all oldies music. And I really sucked because talk about having your career come to a screeching halt. And that's what happened. And I went from that to, all that fancy music of, 94.7, the true oldies channel, which was the biggest piece of crap imaging I've ever heard in my life. And it fired into a Temptation song, My Girl. And I normally love that song. It's a great song, Motown song. But in that moment, I hated it for obvious reasons. But I was like one of 4 people that didn't get let go, and they hired a whole new staff. And then they hired some management that didn't really know what the hell they were doing, which was clear by the way they ran things. And the program director that ended up being the program director was like a promotions person, had no idea what he was doing. He was about my age, if not younger, and he acted like he knew everything. So this is very corporate America sounding, right? You know, the guy comes in who wants to do it. Mind you, the guy's 20 something years old, or maybe 30, and he's trying to tell everybody about the oldies, which he didn't know anything about. But we had John Records Landecker, Dick Biondi, Greg Brown, all these legendary radio guys come and eventually work at the station. I worked with John Records Landecker, a great guy, had amazing stories about rock and roll and radio in the 70s in Chicago at WLS AM radio, and a great storyteller. Why am I telling all this? Because of working with John Landecker, I ended up at WGN Radio because they were impressed by working with some of these radio legends. I then produced for Dean Richards over at WGN Radio, and Dean had the entertainment show, great shows on Sunday mornings. And I remember producing for Dean, and Dean, he's a South Sider, and so am I. I grew up in Palos Hills, but spent a lot of time near Midway, either working or visiting my family that lived up on 51st in Austin. So I had that South Side swagger that you have when you're in your mid-20s, trying to show everybody on the North Side that we know what we're doing, and we're probably better than you are. And I remember I'm sitting in the booth, and this is at WGN Radio on Michigan Avenue, right? So Michigan Avenue, WGN Radio was a legendary place. It had the street side studio that you looked right onto the plaza. The Wrigley building was your view. You looked down Michigan Avenue South, and it was just a glorious spot. It was like a fishbowl, and it was amazing. I loved producing. And then the way they had WGN Radio set up, they had the producer spot, they had a glass wall, and then in the front here where everybody saw on the street, it was almost 360 room where you can see into the studio, and that's where the main on-air person was. So Dean, being Dean, you know, he's taking calls, and Dean could be a little bit of he pushed back because Dean knew what he liked. He still does. Knows what he likes. He knows how to do it. He's been doing radio longer than I've been alive. And it's hard he's intimidating, right? Dean Richards, you hear him on the commercials for Victory Auto Records or any promo during the Cubs games in the 90s on WGN TV. You heard that all the time. So I'm producing for this guy that I grew up essentially listening to and then watching on WGN News. And Dean, you know, you got to read as a producer, you got to give them cards that says like, oh, this spot is brought to you by Menards or whatever, you know, you read these things. So I would get in his ear, you hear a little button, and it calls in his ear while he's on the air. And, you know, I tell him, hey, Dean, you got a break here in a minute, and this is break. So I'm doing like this to Dean, and I'm telling him what we need to do. And we worked together for a couple times, and I started getting him more and more often as his producer was on vacation or whatnot. So this one time, I haven't really talked to him that much because he's intimidating. He's Dean Richards, but he knows what he's doing. And this particular time, we're in the studio, and he's talking, and I'm talking. And I'm telling him what's coming up and what guests are coming up and the whole thing. And finally, Dean looks at me, he goes, hey, and this is through the, through the call and the headphones here from studio to studio. He looks at me, he goes, you know what? He's like, you don't suck at this. And I remember looking at him, I go, thanks, man. Neither do you. And it was just like a matter of fact that was that, you know, and Dean then looked at me, hit the button again. He smiled and he kind of looked at me. He goes, where are you from? I said, from the South Side of Chicago. And he goes, I knew it. And when I said, what do you mean? He's like, oh, I'm from, you know, Oak Lawn, South Shore. And from that moment was the moment that my life changed forever in terms of my broadcasting career, because Dean and I became friends. We talked a lot about it and what I wanted to do. And Dean basically said, like, what are you doing here? With all respect to radio, like, you could be doing so much more than the weekend fill-in guy. You know what I mean? He said you should be on WGN TV, you know, helping out there as a segment coordinator or producer. I had no idea. I didn't take I took one TV class in college, and that was it. So, and I hated it. I went to Illinois State. I worked at WZND, the radio station there, and I loved it. I took a class at TV 10. I thought it was cheesy. I didn't want to do it. So I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Well, lo and behold, a position opens up. I tell Dean recommends, I do the interview. And the first question out of the gate from the program or the news director over at WGN, his name was Greg Caputo, legendary newsman in the business. He says, why should I hire you with no TV experience? So that's a fair question. And I kind of anticipated that I would get something like that. And I just said, the reason why you should hire me is because I'm not in television, because I haven't been taught anything by the way it used to be, or this is how we do it. I could just tell you what I think is what sucks and what doesn't suck. And he kind of looked at me and he's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, we do a lot of things that are cheesy, like they're cheesy TV things, you know? And I said, this is WGN, you know, like you guys do lots of great things. The morning show is great. And I can do that for the midday show because this is what the opening was for. And at this time, it was the midday show that expanded from an hour, it was an hour and a half, to what it is now, which is 2 full hours. I said, I know it looks good. I know what's going on in the city. I know what restaurants are open. And I can bring all that and give that vibe here. And mind you, at the time, WGN Midday News was not doing well. And it was because of the expansion, not because they weren't good. It was just because of the expansion. They changed the lineup. They just brought on Steve Sanders and Allison Payne to be the hosts of this midday show. So, I say all this to him. I said, this is why you should hire me, because I'm young. I know the city. I love the city, and I can bring that fresh perspective to the midday show. And I got hired like a month later, waiting. I get hired and I take the job, and it wasn't easy by any means, because I was the new guy who had no idea how to do television, working for the 3rd largest market television station, which is legendary at WGN TV, right? So I got some pushback when I got hired. I mean, the camera guys hated me. The producers that I worked with didn't like me because I didn't know TV, and they shouldn't have liked me, because why did they hire this idiot who's never been doing anything in television? Why did they get the job? So I did get the job, and we had a couple, battle royales, if you will, of like trying to figure things out, people being frustrated with me because I didn't know, and I was frustrated because I didn't know. In particular, there were 2 people at the very early stages of my career in television that I need to give credit to. One of them is Jackie Keenan. She was the producer for the midday show, and she basically got to a point where I said, either you can help me or I'll just keep annoying you until we're done working together. And to her credit, she taught me television. She taught me like the nuts and bolts of how to put a segment together. Because, in radio, you just kind of put the thing in the calendar. Here's who you're talking to. Here's the stuff, and that's it. Or TV, there's this whole other part that you never think of in radio. You have to think about what the intro looks like, what video you're using, what graphics to be used, how you're going to get out of it, what questions to ask. I mean, there's all this stuff that I never knew. And Jackie taught me how to do it. And she did it, and she was patient with me. And I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Jackie Keenan taking 5 minutes to show me, begrudgingly at first. And then we became really good friends, And the other person who till this day, right now in 2024, who had a huge impact on my life, her name is Jennifer Lyons. And she was the executive producer of WGN Morning News in the year 2008. She was intimidating because she was running the #1 morning show in Chicago that was kicking everybody's ass. They were. And she was really good, and she is really good. It's why she's now the general manager and president of news over at CBS Chicago, where I currently work. But I say that because she taught me how to do TV. Like, Jackie taught me how to do TV segments. Jen taught me how to do TV. And lots of people at WGN also had a lot of things to do with that. Ray Moffat, Sean Maroney, Willie Sneed, Dina Bear, huge one for Dina. Dina taught me, about making the TV look good and caring about how it looks to others, in a way that other people didn't. Everybody had that, but Dina had this pixie dust that she would sprinkle on things, and you would just say, I need to do better to make it look like that. And that's what she did, and then Aline Cox, Savo, who is probably the best comedy writer that I've ever seen or heard, either acted out or listened to. Those people are who really taught me. Terry Barthel, who did the job that I always wanted to do, and then I finally got to do it as the around town producer over at WGN, taught me like how to not take yourself so seriously. And then the morning show in general, Robin Baumgarten, Larry Potash, Conrad, Tomasulo, they taught me so much just by watching them, right? They taught me what comic timing is. So did Sabo, by the way. But in not taking yourself too seriously, knowing that we're not like curing cancer, we're giving people the news. And we could either give it like everybody else and be boring, or we can give the news and also have a little fun with our personalities. And that's really truly the essence of what like the WGN Morning News is their personalities on full display. And either you like them or you don't. They really don't care. They kind of just go with it. And it's worked for 25 plus years. So I learned all that. And, you know, I've worked at WGN for a long time doing stories like the Around Town segment on a digital platform. And then I had this bright idea to get out of news for like a hot minute and do some nonprofit work, which could be a whole entire other podcast. I did nonprofit work in Chicago at a place that was awful to work for and at, morally, ethically, the whole thing. Again, that's another podcast that I'll get to later. And then I got back into news, because by way of just keeping contacts and in doing my stories from the 78 page, which this is the first podcast of that page we'll get to in a little bit, I kept the contacts, ended up at CBS Chicago, and it's been a great fit for me. I get to do the things that I did in the beginning at WGN that really made me happy, and I feel appreciated, and it was great to work with Jennifer Lyons again, and then you have Sandy Pudar, and you have Dana Ballard, and many other people who I never met before that are great to be with. Jackie Kostick, who I work with a lot, Lou Kleinberg, who is one of our great camera people there, Noel, everybody. So it's been this transition. But through all that, I always want to do something for my own. This is my long, rambling podcast, the first one. So these will get better, I promise. But I did a website called Stories from the 78 because I wanted to stay in the media while I was in this nonprofit world. And my friend Sean Bush, who has encouraged me to do it, he built the site for me from scratch. My wife came up with the logos. So between Sean Bush and my wife, Laura Barnas, I have this Stories from the 78 website. And I just want to feature a little bit more and give people a little behind the scenes looks at what each week kind of brings. And that's what this first one is. I didn't even know what I was going to say. It took me like 10 minutes just to start talking because I didn't know what to say. And this is what came out. But each week I will talk about things that I do and people I meet and the whole thing. And the next podcast will just pick up right where I am in the week and we'll just go from there. So I appreciate you listening, and hopefully I'll give you some insight to what goes on in Chicago media and where I travel. I'll do this where I travel. I went to Maine last year. We'll get into some of that. Germany. And, you know, a lot of stuff going on in Chicago week after week. So I'll give you some behind the scenes stories of what it's like to produce for a television station in Chicago and also as your own content creator. That's what I'm doing. That's what this podcast is. So if you're listening, thank you. If you have any questions or comments, you go over to the YouTube channel and you'll see all the videos that I have. There's over 1,000 videos up there between my time at WGN and also my Stories from the 78 page. Go and comment over there. It's storiesfromthe78.com is the website. Or you can hit me up by email, tombarnaschicago@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you next week.